I suppose it could have turned into a normal hobby like taxidermy, but it didn't. It veered off into this.
No father envisions his son growing up to have their life look like a horror movie, but sometimes the horror movies still don't get it as real as it can be. Some children seem to just be happy and outgoing in normal ways, but one in particular found interest in death, bones, organs, and fantasy. On May 21st, 1960, Lionel Dahmer and his wife will have a son that first seems normal. No warning signs, no thoughts of what could possibly be coming. The childhood of Jeffrey Dahmer is just the other side of the hand when it comes to the disturbing parts of Jeffrey's life. This is the little boy next door, Jeffrey Dahmer.
Hi, Jeff. Sherry, how are you? It's good to see you. Good to see you. You feel entirely relaxed?
Of course. How much sleep did you get last night?
More way to start a week, huh?
Mm-hmm. Happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's Day, too.
It has to be a living nightmare to have a child that you raise to not be what you wanted that child to be, and they would forever be known as a monster to society. Lionel Dahmer talks about his son, Jeff Dahmer, as a very sweet, loving, caring person, a son he knows. But Lionel even says there's still things that he can't understand that confuse him. When Jeff was born, he had no head trauma, no real issues that his parents were aware of. He was a sweet little boy that loved people and showed affection where he was supposed to show affection. Lionel even says something that's heartbreaking. He says he still remembers the breath, the baby breath of Jeff when he was born, the sweetness. As a parent, to hear that, it's heartbreaking. And the reality of the situation is that Lionel Dahmer is another victim of Jeff, but one that lived with traumatic heartache. But as Jeff grew older and he hit the age around 7, Lionel said that he could see Jeff closing in, becoming shy, losing confidence. We know that Jeff's mother has been a little more private than Jeff's father, Lionel, and most of what's been let out from Jeff's time growing up with his parents' marriage has come mostly from Lionel, the messy details. Lionel and Joyce, Jeff's parents, it's known that they didn't have a great marriage. They would argue and yell loudly in the house. Lionel says that Joyce had a hard time with postpartum depression, especially after Jeff's younger brother was born, David. One thing that we know with serial killers' childhoods, you can't fix their childhood. You can't go back and make them better or change how they saw it. There's no doubt that damage was done to Jeff as a child, with pushing his shyness, wanting to be alone. Maybe Jeff seeing his parents yell at one another, the people that are supposed to be there to comfort and protect him, make him feel safe. They did the complete opposite, to where Jeff disassociated, pulling back, and hiding. But looking at Jeff's later life, there's no doubt he had anger issues that may travel all the way back to his young childhood. One thing that's odd about Jeff is that Jeff never hurt animals. Many other serial killers in their childhood, most of them, if not all of them, have a past of torturing animals. But Jeff didn't find pleasure in torture. It was the opposite. He loved his animals he had. This would also be a key situation that you would see later on in Jeff's life. When looking at Jeff's parents, we see Lionel, who is more understanding and wanting to dig in the detail of why Jeff is the way he is, understanding that something's gone wrong long ago and Jeff is sick, but he accepts this and still loves his son. The family moved from Wisconsin to Ohio to the now famous home where Jeff would take his first victim. The move did not do well for Jeff or his mother. Joyce was just recovering from the birth of Jeff's younger brother, David. With Jeff's mother, Joyce, it's different. Joyce says she loves her son, that Jeff had a great childhood, but Joyce paints a different picture than Lionel when talking about Jeff's childhood, and says she believes whatever this is that's happened with Jeff, there's something inside of him that he's created. One thing that Lionel and Joyce agree on and that they've said in interviews. They say that Jeff, he's not a monster, he's a human, and they wanted to help him. He's still their son. Many people blame Lionel for being too naive, for such a smart man, saying that he should have and he could have saw something with Jeff early in his life that showed more than just concerns of Jeff's shyness. Lionel was convinced that a double hernia operation is what derailed Jeff's brain and put a lack of empathy with Jeff for people. When Jeff was 4, Lionel said he awoke after his surgery in the hospital with so much pain in his groin muscle that it did something to him. And from that day, he started to lose his sweetness. Even 30 years later, Lionel is still convinced that the operation had something to do with Jeff early on. There's key moments in Jeff's childhood that we know about. Jeff says before he really started to collect carcasses of dead animals, earlier events took place that helped push that. When Jeff was a young boy, a skunk died under the house where the Dahmers lived. The skunk decomposed and still left a great odor under the house. But as Lionel went to go remove the skunk, placing the bones in a metal bucket, Jeff picked up the bones, clanking them and laughing. Lionel seemed to not really think much of it, other than he was surprised that Jeff wasn't scared or upset. This could be a sign that something was off with Jeff at a young age, or it introduced a new element to Jeff. He wasn't grossed out, he wasn't scared, he was interested, but Jeff was a little boy that liked to play in the woods, and maybe he just didn't understand the situation. It's not unusual for little boys to show interest in deceased animals that they find outside. Jeff also said there was a time when he was in the woods and found a dog that had died. He took the dog, removed its head, and stuck it on a spike in the woods. There was a time many of these stories that start to arise out of Jeff's childhood were kept secret until Jeff was in prison. Early on when Jeff was a child, Lionel, studying for his PhD and eventually becoming a research chemist. With Lionel in this line of work, Jeff found interest in what his father did, also learning about chemicals like acids and preservatives that he would use on his victims later on. Lionel simply thought that Jeff was showing a positive interest in chemistry, but as Jeff became older, Lionel could see that Jeff was collecting bones, studying them, painting them, and building skeletons. But somehow, Lionel was still naive to maybe what the situation looked like to a child. Lionel and Joyce would divorce, bringing more turmoil in Jeff's life and solidifying the element of abandonment with Jeff. And what are some big key ingredients with how he treats his victims in the future? When Jeff is older, going into his early teens, his sexuality is coming through, and like most teenagers, he's looking for acceptance, friends, and his hormones are bringing new thoughts that he's having to deal with. But now with Jeff's hormones starting, this would be the flame to the wick that would start to burn, building Jeff's secret fantasy in his head of what he really wanted from another human. Lionel said that it was after Jeff was in prison that he learned that Jeff used to go out on his bike with a garbage bag, going up and down the road, finding roadkill and throwing it in the bag, dogs, squirrels, small rodents, and bring it all back to his home. And this became a weekly habit for him. This is how the obsession started to take shape with Jeff, with what was going on inside of animals and humans, with their organs, bones, and keeping specimens for his collection. Jeff says in an interview himself that when he was doing this as a young boy, as he was collecting the roadkill, this is also when he would start rubbing his fingers through the entrails of the animals, skinning them, defleshing them, keeping the bones. He was already in the process in his apartment in Milwaukee. Lionel says that when Jeff was born, he was beautiful and had the sweetness of a baby's breath, and just thought he was a normal baby boy, destined to do wonderful things in the world. But Jeff says from his own mouth, when he was 14 years old, he knew something was not right with him. He started to have fantasies and thoughts non-stop about violence and sex intermingled with each other, and even at that age, Jeff knew something was wrong. He says it was frightening and confusing. Jeff knew that he was attracted to men growing up and kept this secret. He grew up in a Christian home and felt extremely scared to ever let it out. With Jeff having a childhood mixed with mutilating animals and enjoying it on such a high level, and now with his hormones pushing right into the same bubble, it's not hard to see why Jeff felt shy and reserved. And on top of all that, was dealing with parents in the home fighting as Ted continued to get older and worse himself secretly. Joyce is said to be getting worse herself from depression and making rash decisions. Lionel would wake up in the middle of the night to find Joyce in the yard with her nightgown on, just lying in the yard. As Jeff found himself in high school, he had already been drinking for a few years. From a young age, and with high school having its own challenges for Jeff, he would show up to school drunk. Jeff had friends in high school and was known as the prankster in his friends group. This is even a trade that would follow Jeff all the way to his last days in prison, with inmates that knew Jeff and were around him, saying that he was always pulling pranks and joking around with other inmates. But as Jeff turns 18, and now reaching his boiling point, we see Jeff fall right into suit to what many successful serial killers say they do right before they act out their first murder. They allow themselves to be in situations of opportunity. Jeff talks about the fantasy and having complete submission over a man in his mind. At one point, around Jeff's house in Ohio, he would see a runner daily, and one day Jeff simply made up his mind to hide in the bushes on the side of the road with a log in his hand and wait for the runner. But luckily for the runner, he never came across Jeff's path. Jeff says his mind is non-stop with thoughts that he doesn't know how to express to anyone. Around this same time, Joyce and Lionel would file for divorce, concealing the abandonment Jeff felt for his parents. In 1978, it's a year that Jeff steps out into waters he's only looked out to. In that year, Jeff's father, Lionel, remarries to Sherry Dahmer, who becomes Jeff's stepmother, and Jeff becomes very close with. At this point, Jeff has made up his mind that he's going to attack somebody, that he may have to murder them, and that he's going to have full range and control over someone's body. He just doesn't know who, but he knows it needs to be a stranger. And this is where Stephen Hicks, 18, comes into Jeff's life, and in that same day is being murdered by him. Many killers talk about the impulse that is overwhelming to act on, that they can't submerge it to the bottom of their brain. It just keeps popping up, and Jeff talks about this impulse on many different occasions when he can. Many people know the story of Jeff acting out his first murder on Stephen Hicks. Jeff had been looking for an opportunity, and that would play out with Stephen. In one of Jeff's last interviews, he said this: "I'd had fantasies about picking up a hitchhiker and taking them back to the house and having complete dominance and control over him." And that's just what happened. 1978, Jeff was coming back home from shopping at the mall, bored and left alone with his thoughts, when he saw Stephen Hicks holding out his thumb and asking for a ride. To Jeff's amazement, it's his fantasy, a young man he doesn't know who's hitchhiking. Jeff picks up Stephen and then somehow talks Stephen into going back to his house where Jeff lived in Akron, Ohio. They smoke, they drink, they laugh. Jeff wants Stephen to make a pass, but Stephen is straight and eventually starts talking about wanting to leave. But Jeff keeps telling Stephen to relax and keep drinking, but it eventually ends in blood, with Stephen now demanding that he wants to leave. Jeff will kill Stephen by smashing his head in with a barbell. And weird enough, from Jeff's first murder, this is how he would die years later in prison. And so it starts, the long-awaited fantasy Jeff's been wanting and dreaming of. He's waited years for this moment, but he's also in shock and disbelief of what he's done. Jeff simply does what he'll practice in the future. He cuts off the body, keeping it around the house for a few days, pulling it out when he wants to spend alone time with it, but eventually taking what's left that he still has around the house and breaking it up in pieces, throwing it through his woods and over the embankment covered in ivy, to where the bones of Stephen will not be found for over a decade. It must have been a hard and terrible thought for Lionel to know that Jeff killed and tore apart a young man in his own home and decomposed the body throughout the yard, right under Lionel's nose. Lionel said he never saw blood or the smell of iron, that's in blood, around the house. He never noticed anything different about Jeff, or never saw that there was a missing boy from the town next door. And what was a fully grown 18-year-old boy has now become compost. Jeff's 18 and just killed someone who's the same age as he is, but he just continues with daily life. But he has the thought of Steven with him every day, of what he did and what he saw with him. Jeff's drinking and behavior continues to grow and get worse. His zeal and luster for life doesn't seem to be there. From the moment Jeff leaves his home in Ohio, things continue to go downhill for him. He finds himself in more trouble, and to try to straighten out, he joins the army. But his drinking increases, and he's let go from duty and sent back home. When Jeff returns home, he tries to stop drinking. He tries to join a church. He says he stops watching pornography, but it's only for a short season before Jeff finds opportunity once again. Lionel Dahmer, for the last 30 years, has been trying to say that his son is not a monster, that he's a human, that had a problem, that festered and turned into something unimaginable. It's a message for parents that Lionel wants to be heard, to watch and love your children and take notice of their shyness, their lack of zeal for life, for empathy. Lionel really still can't explain what happened to Jeff. It's a hole in the heart that Lionel will never recover from. And looking at Lionel's side of the story, it's heartbreaking that a father had to watch his son be paraded around as a monster, learn about the gruesome things he had done to people, stand by his son, see his son die in prison, and then even fight over his son's body for over a year to get it back. The rest of the story with Jeff has been told. As he moves out and becomes a loner, he finds himself in trouble with simple things from soliciting young men, getting caught. Jeff starts mixing cocktails while he has men in private places where they're passing out, becoming unconscious, and even so, to where Jeff finds himself alone in a hotel room with his next victim, to where Jeff slips him a cocktail, and all Jeff can say is that when he woke up, he had beaten the young man to death. And Jeff says this is what lit the wick again, the little boy that turned into the world's most notorious serial killer, Jeff Dahmer.
To this day, I don't know what started it. And the person to blame is sitting right across from you. That's the only person. Not parents, not society, not pornography. I mean, those are just excuses.